Mrs. Helena has always been known for her elegance and generosity. At 78 years old, she was a woman of striking presence, with well-groomed gray hair and a welcoming smile. Her home, an imposing mansion in the city's most prestigious neighborhood, reflected the luxurious life she had always led. Artworks adorned the walls, and the garden looked like it had been taken straight out of a fairy tale, with exotic flowers and marble fountains. Everything started to change when Mrs. Helena began to feel an unusual weakness. At first, she thought it was just fatigue, something temporary. But over time, the symptoms intensified: dizziness, loss of appetite, and an exhaustion that prevented her from getting out of bed. Concerned, her niece, Anna, decided it was time to seek professional help. This is how Carlos entered Mrs. Helena's life. He was an experienced nurse, 45 years old, known for his dedication and care in dealing with patients. When he arrived at the mansion for the first time, Carlos was impressed by the grandeur of the place, but upon meeting Mrs. Helena, he realized that her greatest wealth was her generous heart and the wisdom she had accumulated over the years. Mrs. Helena, initially, was a bit resistant to the idea of having a nurse take care of her. "I don't like to depend on others, Carlos," she said, with a firm look. "I understand completely, Mrs. Helena. I'm here to help in whatever is needed, without invading your space," he responded, with a gentle smile. Gradually, she began to accept Carlos's presence. As the days passed, Carlos became a constant and comforting presence in Mrs. Helena's life. He helped her take her medications, prepared light and delicious meals, and, most importantly, was always ready to listen to her stories and concerns. "You know, Carlos, life hasn't always been easy, even with all this wealth," she confided one day. "I can imagine you've been through a lot, Mrs. Helena," he said, encouraging her to continue. The relationship between them began to strengthen when Carlos noticed that Mrs. Helena had a special glow in her eyes when she spoke about the past. "Tell me more about your youth, Mrs. Helena. It must have been a fascinating time," he asked, genuinely interested. And so, between one story and another, they built a sincere and deep friendship. One day, while adjusting Mrs. Helena's pillows, Carlos noticed that she was more dejected than usual. "Are you all right, Mrs. Helena? You seem worried today," he asked, concerned. "It's just this illness, Carlos. Sometimes I feel so powerless," she replied, with a sigh. "We're in this together, Mrs. Helena. I'll take care of you until you're well," he said, gently holding her hand. Carlos's dedication did not go unnoticed. Anna, the niece, commented to Mrs. Helena on how committed he was to her well-being. "Aunt, Carlos is an angel. I've never seen anyone treat another person with so much care," Anna said during a visit. "Yes, he has been a great support. I feel more at ease knowing he's here," Mrs. Helena agreed. Over time, Mrs. Helena began to trust Carlos more, sharing secrets and fears she had never told anyone before. "Carlos, did you know that I always wanted to be an artist? But I ended up following the business path due to my father's influence," she revealed. "It's never too late to rediscover our dreams, Mrs. Helena. Who knows, you might still have time to explore that artistic side," he suggested, with a twinkle in his eye. Day by day, Carlos became more than just a nurse. He was a friend, a confidant. Mrs. Helena felt more secure and supported with him around. "Carlos, you've brought light to my darkest days. I'm grateful every day that you're here," she said, emotional. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to meet someone as incredible as you, he replied, sincerely. So, between medical care and deep conversations, a beautiful friendship blossomed. Mrs. Helena, once resistant, could no longer imagine her days without Carlos's comforting presence. And he, in turn, felt honored to care for such a wise and inspiring woman. The illness brought challenges, but also the opportunity for a bond that would change both their lives forever. Carlos would wake up early every day, and his first task was to prepare Mrs. Helena's breakfast. He always chose fresh fruits and made a natural juice that she loved. "Good morning, Mrs. Helena. I brought your favorite juice," he would say, entering the room with a tray. "Thank you, Carlos. You always know how to please me," she would respond with a smile. Over time, the two began to chat more during these peaceful mornings. "Carlos, did you always want to be a nurse?" she asked, curious. "Actually, no. I wanted to be a doctor, but life took me down a different path," he replied, while cutting the fruits. "I think you have the gift of care, regardless of the title," she said, thoughtfully. The afternoons were dedicated to leisure moments. Carlos would read books to Mrs. Helena, or they would watch old movies together. "Have you seen Gone with the Wind?" she asked one day. "No, not yet," he replied. "Then today we're going to watch it." "It's a classic," exclaimed Mrs. Helena, excited. And so, they would spend hours immersed in stories that brought a little joy and distraction. One time, while watching a movie, Mrs. Helena opened up about her loneliness. "Carlos, sometimes I feel so alone in this huge house," she confessed. "I understand, Mrs. Helena. But know that I'm here for whatever you need," he said, holding her hand. "You've been a valuable companion." "I don't know what I'd do without you," she replied, emotional. Carlos also enjoyed listening to Mrs. Helena's stories from the past. "Tell me more about your childhood," he asked. "Oh, my childhood was full of adventures. I used to run around the fields of my parents' farm," she recounted, with a sparkle in her eyes. "It seems like you had a wonderful childhood," he commented, admiring. Over time, small gestures of affection became routine. Carlos always brought a flower from the garden to brighten Mrs. Helena's room. "Look, Mrs. Helena, a rose to decorate your day," he would say, handing her the flower. "How beautiful, Carlos. You really know how to make me smile," she would thank him, touched by the gesture. In moments when Mrs. Helena felt most fragile, Carlos was there to offer emotional support. "Carlos, I'm afraid of what the future holds," she said one night. "You don't need to be afraid, Mrs. Helena. We'll face everything together," he responded firmly. "Thank you, Carlos. Your presence gives me strength," she said, with a tear in her eye. The relationship of trust between them grew every day. Mrs. Helena began to share secrets she had never told anyone before. "Carlos, did you know that I was once in love with an artist? But my father didn't let me marry him," she revealed. "That must have been difficult, Mrs. Helena. But you've lived an admirable life," he said, understanding. Carlos also shared a bit of his own life with Mrs. Helena. "I grew up in a humble family, but I've always had the dream of helping people," he told her. "And you're fulfilling that dream magnificently," she responded, admired. The conversations between them became increasingly deep and meaningful. With each small gesture of affection, the friendship between Carlos and Mrs. Helena grew stronger. "Carlos, you're like a son to me," she said one day, emotional. "And you're like a mother to me, Mrs. Helena," he responded, with an affectionate smile. This special connection brought new meaning to both of their lives. So, between daily care and deep conversations, an unlikely bond was formed. Mrs. Helena, once lonely, now felt supported and valued. And Carlos, who had started there as a nurse, was becoming an increasingly dear and indispensable friend. Their relationship was not just that of patient and caretaker, but of two souls who had found each other and supported each other in the most difficult moments. Lately, Roberto had been increasingly distant. Mrs. Helena noticed that he was spending more time away from home, always with flimsy excuses. "Roberto, you've been going out a lot lately. Is everything all right?" she asked, concerned. "Oh, it's just work, Helena. Nothing to worry about," he replied, avoiding her gaze. But Mrs. Helena's intuition told her that something was wrong. She began to pay more attention to the small details. Roberto was always on his phone, and often went to another room to take calls. "Roberto, why do you always have to go to another room to answer the phone?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "It's just noisy, Helena. It's hard to hear in here," he responded, visibly uncomfortable. One day, while tidying their room, Mrs. Helena found an envelope hidden in Roberto's drawer. Her heart raced as she saw photos of Roberto with a younger woman, smiling and embracing in various poses. "Who is this, Roberto? And why do you have these photos hidden?" she questioned, holding back tears. "Helena, you're imagining things. She's just a work friend," he lied blatantly. Mrs. Helena's suspicions grew. She decided to check Roberto's phone while he was sleeping. With trembling hands, she found affectionate messages exchanged between him and Mariana. "My love, I can't wait to see you today," said a message from Roberto. "Always yours, Mariana," the other replied. "My God, it can't be true," Mrs. Helena whispered, feeling the ground giving way under her feet. The next morning, she confronted Roberto with the evidence in hand. "Roberto, I saw the messages." "Who is Mariana?" she asked, trying to stay calm. "Helena, stop this. You're being paranoid," he replied, irritated. "Paranoid? And these photos? And these messages? Do you think I'm blind?" she retorted, her voice trembling with anger. Roberto tried to deny everything, but Mrs. Helena would not be fooled. "Helena, you're making a mountain out of a molehill. Mariana is just a colleague," he insisted. "A colleague you call my love? Don't treat me like an idiot, Roberto," she shouted, feeling betrayed and humiliated. "You don't understand, Helena. Our marriage is no longer the same," he tried to justify. Mrs. Helena couldn't believe what she was hearing. "So instead of trying to fix things, you decide to betray me?" she asked, incredulous. I don't know what to say, Helena. Things just happened," he said, lowering his head. "That's not an excuse, Roberto. You've destroyed the trust we had," she responded, with tears in her eyes. She felt a mix of sadness and anger. "I've always been faithful to you, Roberto. I've always been by your side. And this is how you repay me?" she questioned, trying to understand. "Helena, I'm so sorry." "I really am," he said, seeming genuinely remorseful. "Being sorry won't erase what you've done," she said, her voice firm. After the confrontation, Mrs. Helena felt devastated. "Carlos, I don't know what to do. Roberto betrayed me with another woman," she confided, crying. "Mrs. Helena, I'm here for whatever you need." "You're not alone," said Carlos, trying to comfort her. "Thank you, Carlos. Your presence means so much to me," she replied, wiping away her tears. Mrs. Helena knew she needed to make a decision about the future of her marriage. "Roberto, we need to have a serious conversation about what's going to happen from here on," she said, days later. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes to regain your trust," he responded, with a tone of remorse. "We'll see, Roberto. We'll see," she said, making it clear that it wouldn't be easy. And so, with a heavy heart and a mind full of doubts, Mrs. Helena began to reflect on the next steps. Roberto's betrayal had deeply shaken her trust, but she knew she had to be strong. With Carlos by her side, she felt she could face any challenge, even those that came from the person she least expected. Carlos was finishing up in the kitchen when he heard voices coming from Roberto's office. Curious and suspicious, he approached quietly. "We need to act soon, Mariana. Helena won't live forever," he heard Roberto say, with coldness in his voice. "I know, but we have to be careful. She can't suspect anything," Mariana whispered in response. Carlos's heart raced. He hid behind a door and continued listening. "I've already transferred part of the money to the overseas account. We just need the rest," said Roberto. "And when are we going to do this?" "I can't wait any longer," asked Mariana, impatient. "We'll find a way to speed things up." "Helena doesn't notice anything," Roberto responded, confident. Carlos felt a mix of anger and disbelief. How could Roberto be so cruel? "He trusts you, Roberto. How can you do this to her?" thought Carlos, outraged. "We need to be discreet. Any mistake and our whole plan will go down the drain," Mariana continued. "Relax, Mariana. We're almost there," said Roberto, self-assured. Carlos waited until the conversation was over and the two left the office. He knew he had to tell Mrs. Helena everything, but how? "I need to be careful. This will devastate her," he thought, worried. He went to Mrs. Helena's room, where she was resting. "Mrs. Helena, I need to speak with you." "It's urgent," he said, his voice trembling. Mrs. Helena opened her eyes slowly and saw Carlos's serious expression. "What happened, Carlos? You seem concerned," she said, sitting up in bed. "I overheard a conversation between Roberto and Mariana. They're planning to steal your entire fortune," he revealed, trying to be as clear as possible. "What? This can't be true," she exclaimed, shocked. "I heard everything, Mrs. Helena. They've already transferred part of the money to an overseas account," explained Carlos, holding her hand. "I can't believe Roberto would do this to me." "Is he with Mariana?" she asked, trying to process the information. "Yes, they're in this together." "We need to act quickly," responded Carlos, determined. Mrs. Helena felt a mix of sadness and anger. How could he betray me in this way? And Mariana? "I don't even know her," she said, with tears in her eyes. "We need to come up with a plan to protect your assets," said Carlos, trying to remain calm. "You're right, Carlos. I can't let them get away with this," she replied, wiping away her tears. Carlos and Mrs. Helena spent the afternoon planning their next steps. First, we need to freeze all joint accounts, suggested Carlos. Yes, and I'll speak to my lawyer to make sure Roberto doesn't have access to my money anymore, she agreed. We need concrete evidence. I can try to record a conversation between them, said Carlos. Good idea, Carlos. Let's do it, she replied, with a new spark of determination. The next day, Carlos began to execute the plan. He discreetly installed a recorder in Roberto's office. I hope this works, he thought, while adjusting the equipment. During the night, he listened to another incriminating conversation between Roberto and Mariana. The recording is perfect. This will be a huge help, he said to himself, satisfied. With the recordings in hand, Carlos and Mrs. Helena met with the lawyer. This evidence is more than enough to take legal action, said the lawyer, after listening to the recordings. I want Roberto and Mariana to pay for this, said Mrs. Helena, firmly. We'll make sure they can't touch another penny, the lawyer assured. Thank you, Carlos. I don't know what I'd do without you, said Mrs. Helena, holding his hand. Carlos smiled, feeling relieved to have helped Mrs. Helena uncover the truth. I will always be here for you, Mrs. Helena, he said, sincerely. Let's put an end to this sinister plan once and for all, she responded, determined. Together, they knew they could face any challenge and protect what was right. In the days following the revelation, Mrs. Helena felt increasingly isolated. Roberto and Mariana's betrayal had deeply shaken her trust in people. Carlos, sometimes it feels like the world has collapsed on me, she said, with teary eyes. I understand, Mrs. Helena. But know that I am here with you, always, responded Carlos, trying to comfort her. Mrs. Helena spent hours staring out the window, lost in thought. Carlos, do you think I'll ever feel whole again? She asked, her voice trembling. I believe so, Mrs. Helena. But these things take time, he replied, gently. It's hard to believe that right now, she said, sighing. One day, during one of these conversations, Mrs. Helena made an unexpected request. Carlos, can I ask you something? She asked, hesitant. Of course, Mrs. Helena. Whatever you need, he responded, curious. Can you pretend to be my son for a day? Just for a day, so I can feel a little bit of joy again, she asked, with hopeful eyes. Carlos was surprised, but he knew how much it meant to her. Of course, Mrs. Helena. It will be an honor, he said, holding her hand. Thank you, Carlos. This means so much to me, she responded, emotional. Let's make this day something special, he promised, with a smile. The next morning, Carlos prepared a delightful breakfast. Good morning, Mother. I hope you enjoy the breakfast, he said, entering the room with a tray. Good morning, my dear. It's beautiful. Mrs. Helena replied, smiling. They sat together and ate, sharing laughter and stories. Throughout the day, they did activities that Mrs. Helena loved. Shall we take a walk in the garden, Mother? Suggested Carlos. I'd love to, my son. It's been a while since I've walked there, she responded, excited. They strolled through the garden, admiring the flowers and talking about the old days. These roses remind me of my mother, she said, with a nostalgic smile. In the afternoon, Carlos brought an album of old photos for them to look at together. Look at this one, Mother. You were so beautiful, he said, pointing to a photo. Ah, that was at your father's 30th birthday party, she recalled, laughing. You were the star of the party, commented Carlos, making her blush slightly. You've been a wonderful son today, Carlos, she said, emotional. Later, they watched an old movie, one of Mrs. Helena's favorites. Do you remember when we watched Gone with the Wind together? She asked. Of course, Mother. It was an unforgettable day, he responded, smiling. They snuggled on the couch, sharing popcorn and moments of tenderness. Thank you for doing this for me, my son, she said, touching his arm. In the evening, Carlos prepared a special dinner. I hope you enjoy it, Mother. I made your favorite recipe, he said, serving the dish. It's wonderful, my son. You truly made my day special, she responded, with tears of joy in her eyes. I'm glad to hear that, Mother. You deserve all the happiness in the world, he said, sincerely. After dinner, they sat on the porch, looking at the stars. Carlos, this day was a gift to me. You've brought light back into my life, she said, squeezing his hand. I'm happy to be able to help, Mother. I will always be here for you, he responded, with an affectionate smile. You are an angel in my life, Carlos, she said, emotional. As the night came to an end, Mrs. Helena felt a little bit lighter. Thank you, Carlos. Today, I truly felt loved and cared for, she said, as he helped her prepare for bed. It was my pleasure, Mother. Sleep well, he said, kissing her forehead. Good night, my dear. Dream of the angels, she responded, closing her eyes with a smile. And so, on that special day, Carlos was able to bring a little bit of joy and comfort to Mrs. Helena's wounded heart. The bond between them grew even stronger, and she felt less isolated, knowing she could count on someone who truly cared for her. For Carlos, that day was also unforgettable, a testament to the power of caring and true friendship. In the days that followed the special day, Mrs. Helena couldn't stop thinking about how Carlos had brought joy into her life. Carlos, you have no idea how much that day meant to me, she said, smiling. I'm glad to hear that, Mrs. Helena. It was a special day for me as well, he responded, sincerely. You are a blessing in my life, she affirmed, emotional. Mrs. Helena knew she needed to make an important decision. Carlos, I want to talk to you about something serious, she said, suddenly. Of course, Mrs. Helena. What's happening? He asked, concerned. I'm thinking about changing my will. I want to leave my fortune to you, she revealed, firmly. Carlos was dumbfounded. Mrs. Helena, I don't know what to say. This is so... He began, at a loss for words. You deserve it, Carlos. You've been by my side when I needed it most. Roberto and Mariana don't deserve anything, she said, determined. But it's a lot of money, Mrs. Helena. I'm not sure if I can accept it, he said, hesitant. You can and you should, Carlos. I trust you more than anyone else, she affirmed, holding his hand. But what will people think? And what about Roberto? He asked, still reluctant. I don't care what people think. And as for Roberto, he made his bed, she responded, firmly. If you think it's the right thing to do, then I accept, he said, finally. Excellent, Carlos. I'll speak to my lawyer tomorrow and start the changes to the will, she said, relieved. I want you to be present at the meeting, she requested. Of course, Mrs. Helena. I'll be there, he responded, determined to support her. Thank you, Carlos. You have no idea how much this puts my mind at ease, she said, smiling. The next day, they met with Mrs. Helena's lawyer. Mr. Almeida, I want to make a change to my will, she said, with seriousness. Of course, Mrs. Helena. What would you like to change? He asked, picking up a notepad. I want to leave my entire fortune to Carlos, she stated, with determination. Understood, Mrs. Helena. We will initiate the process, the lawyer responded, professionally. Carlos observed everything in silence, still a bit incredulous. Is this really happening? He thought. Carlos, do you understand what this means? Mr. Almeida asked, looking at him. Yes, sir. I understand, he responded, with a nod. Very well. We'll make sure everything is perfectly documented, the lawyer affirmed. After the meeting, Mrs. Helena seemed lighter. I feel I've done the right thing, Carlos, she said, as they left the lawyer's office. If this is what you desire, Mrs. Helena, I am here to honor your decision, he said, holding her hand. You are a good man, Carlos. I know you will take good care of what I'm leaving you, she said, with confidence. I promise I will do my best, he responded, sincerely. In the days that followed, Mrs. Helena's decision brought a new sense of peace to her. Carlos, I'm more at ease knowing everything is in good hands, she said, during a breakfast. I will do everything to honor your trust, Mrs. Helena, he responded, with a smile. You've already done more than I could have imagined. I am eternally grateful, she said, emotional. Carlos, in turn, began to prepare for his new responsibility. I need to learn how to manage all of this properly, he thought, researching wealth management. Carlos, whatever you need, I'll be here to help, said Mrs. Helena, noticing his efforts. Thank you, Mrs. Helena. With your guidance, I know I can do it, he responded, confident. And so, with Mrs. Helena's radical decision, a new chapter began to unfold in both of their lives. Carlos knew he had a great responsibility ahead, but he was determined to honor Mrs. Helena's trust and affection. Together, they prepared to face the future, more united and strengthened than ever. Mrs. Helena, still shaken by the betrayal, called Carlos for a serious conversation. Carlos, we need concrete evidence against Roberto and Mariana. I don't want them to escape unpunished, she said, firmly. I understand, Mrs. Helena. I'll start collecting everything I can, he responded, determined. Be careful, Carlos. They can't know you're watching them, she warned. Carlos began his plan by discreetly installing a recorder in Roberto's office. I hope this works, he thought, nervously. He started observing Roberto and Mariana's movements, waiting for the right moment to act. I can't believe I'm doing this, but it's necessary, he murmured to himself. The recorder captured several suspicious conversations. In one of the recordings, Roberto and Mariana were discussing the details of the plan. We need to transfer the rest of the money before she realizes it, said Roberto. Yes, but we have to be quick. Carlos has been getting too close to her, Mariana responded, concerned. Carlos heard the recording and knew he had something important on his hands. Those two are really incorrigible, he thought. On another occasion, Carlos found incriminating documents in Roberto's office. Money transfer spreadsheets. This is exactly what we need, he said, flipping through the papers. He took photos of all the documents, ensuring he had backup copies. Mrs. Helena is going to be shocked by this, he thought, carefully storing everything. The tension increased every time Carlos approached Roberto's office or belongings. I have to be quick and discreet, he said to himself, peeking through a crack in the door. In a moment of carelessness, he was almost caught by Roberto. Carlos, what are you doing here? Roberto asked, suspicious. Oh, nothing. Just looking for a book, he responded, trying to sound casual. Carlos knew he needed more evidence to ensure that Roberto and Mariana were caught. I need a more compromising recording, he thought. He installed a second recorder near the living room, where the two were known to converse. With luck, I'll get something more concrete, he said, adjusting the device. The wait was agonizing. Finally, the perfect opportunity presented itself. Roberto, we need to finish this soon. Helena is getting smarter, Mariana said, nervous. Don't worry. We're almost there. Soon, everything will be ours, Roberto replied, confident. Carlos heard the recording and knew he had what he needed. This is more than enough, he thought, satisfied. Carlos gathered all the evidence and reviewed it meticulously. Recordings, documents, it's all here, he said, taking inventory. He knew the next step was crucial. I need to deliver this to Mrs. Helena and the lawyer, he thought, organizing everything into a folder. The security of the evidence was his top priority. On the scheduled day, Carlos brought the evidence to Mrs. Helena. Here it is, Mrs. Helena. Recordings and documents, he said, handing her the folder. Thank you, Carlos. You've done an excellent job, she responded, with gratitude. Now, let's show this to the lawyer and put an end to this charade, she said, determined. I'm with you, Mrs. Helena, Carlos affirmed, confidently. They went together to the lawyer's office, where they presented all the evidence. This is more than enough to prosecute Roberto and Mariana, the lawyer said, after reviewing everything. I want them to pay for every penny they tried to steal, Mrs. Helena said, firmly. We'll make sure that justice is served, the lawyer responded, beginning to prepare the legal documents. With the evidence in hand, Mrs. Helena and Carlos knew they had taken a significant step. Carlos, you were amazing. I don't know how to thank you, she said, emotional. I did what needed to be done, Mrs. Helena. Now it's just a matter of time until they get what they deserve, he responded, relieved. United, they awaited the outcome, confident that the truth would prevail. Mrs. Helena and Carlos were sitting in the living room, discussing the next steps. Carlos, we have all the evidence, but we need to make sure everyone knows what Roberto and Mariana did, she said, with determination. I agree, Mrs. Helena. But how are we going to do that? He asked, thoughtful. I was thinking of something big. Something like television, she suggested, with a gleam in her eyes. Carlos was a little surprised by the idea. Television. Do you think that would work? He asked, imagining the impact. Yes, Carlos. We need to ensure they can't escape this. And television has a huge reach, she explained, with conviction. It makes sense. But how are we going to get a TV network interested in our story? He asked, still pondering. Mrs. Helena already had something in mind. I know a journalist, Paulo, who works at a major network. He's always liked impactful stories, she said, confidently. Great, Mrs. Helena. Let's contact him and see if he's interested, Carlos responded, excited. I'll call him right now, she said, picking up the phone. I hope he accepts, Carlos said, hopeful. After a few rings, Paulo answered. Paulo, this is Helena. I have a bombshell story that might interest your network, she said, straight to the point. Helena. Long time no see. What's it about? Paulo asked, curious. It's about a betrayal and an attempted theft. I have all the evidence. This could be a huge scoop, she explained. Tell me more, I'm interested, he said, intrigued. Mrs. Helena explained the entire situation to Paulo. Roberto and Mariana plotted against me. I have recordings, documents, everything, she said, firmly. This is serious, Helena. We need to schedule a meeting to discuss the details, Paulo said, impressed. When can you meet us? She asked, anxious. How about tomorrow afternoon? He suggested. Perfect, we'll be there, she replied, relieved. The next day, Carlos and Mrs. Helena met with Paulo at the network. Helena, Carlos, it's a pleasure to see you. Let's go to my office, Paulo said, guiding them. Thank you for receiving us, Paulo. We have a lot to show, she said, holding the folder with the evidence. I'm eager to see it all, he responded, as they sat down. Carlos started showing the recordings and documents to Paulo. Here are the recordings of the conversations between Roberto and Mariana, he said, as Paulo listened attentively. Incredible. This is really damning, Paulo said, shocked. And here are the documents of the money transfers, Carlos continued, showing the photos. You have a solid case here, Paulo affirmed. After reviewing everything, Paulo was convinced. This is going to be a big news story, he said, excited. We need to plan how we're going to expose this to the public, Mrs. Helena stated, with determination. We'll need careful preparation. We don't want anything to go wrong, Carlos agreed. Leave that to me. We'll do this right, Paulo assured them. They spent the next few hours discussing the details of the plan. First, we'll do an exclusive interview with you, where you'll tell the whole story, said Paulo. We need to ensure the public understands the gravity of the situation, Carlos said, concerned about the message. Don't worry. We'll work on it together, Paulo said, reassuring them. We're going to unmask those two, stated Mrs. Helena. Before leaving the network, Paulo made a promise. Helena, Carlos, we'll do this in a way that ensures everyone knows the truth, he said, with firmness. Thank you, Paulo. We're counting on you, Mrs. Helena responded, emotional. Just relax. We'll figure it out, he said, confident. Let's trust him, Carlos, she said, as they left. Absolutely, Mrs. Helena, he replied, hopeful. Back at home, Mrs. Helena and Carlos were optimistic, but they knew there was still a road ahead. Carlos, I feel we're doing the right thing, she said, feeling lighter. Me too, Mrs. Helena. We'll expose those two and make sure they pay for what they've done, he affirmed, determined. We're in this together, she said, holding his hand. Always, Mrs. Helena, he responded, with a smile. The night of the big reveal finally arrived. Mrs. Helena and Carlos were in the network's waiting room, nervous but determined. Are you ready, Mrs. Helena? Carlos asked, holding her hand. More than ever, Carlos. The time has come to expose the truth, she responded, with a resolute look. Let's seek justice, he added, confidently. In the studio, Paolo was finalizing the last details. Helena, Carlos, we'll live in 5 minutes. Everything ready? He asked, adjusting the microphone. Yes, Paolo. Let's put an end to this charade once and for all, Mrs. Helena said, determined. Just follow the script, and everything will go perfectly, Paolo assured, giving an encouraging smile. We're ready, Carlos responded, firmly. The studio lights turned on, and the broadcast began. Good evening, viewers. Today, we have a shocking story of betrayal and greed, Paolo announced, with seriousness. Here with us are Mrs. Helena and Carlos, who will tell us all about Roberto and Mariana, he continued. Mrs. Helena, can you tell us what happened? He asked, starting the interview. Mrs. Helena began to recount the story, while Carlos showed the evidence. Roberto and Mariana, people I trusted, plotted to steal from me, she said, with a steady voice. Here are the recordings of their conversations, Carlos added, playing the audio. And these documents prove the illegal money transfers, he completed, as the camera focused on the papers. The broadcast was an immediate success. This is outrageous. How could they do this? Paolo reacted, expressing the public's indignation. This evidence is irrefutable, he affirmed, looking at the camera. Roberto and Mariana can't escape this, Mrs. Helena said, with conviction. Justice will be served, Carlos concluded, determined. As the broadcast continued, Roberto and Mariana watched in shock. How is this possible? We're ruined, yelled Roberto, furious. It's your fault. We should have been more careful, Mariana retorted, desperate. This can't be happening, lamented Roberto, feeling the weight of public exposure. We're done for, Mariana concluded, crying. With Roberto and Mariana's public humiliation, justice began to move quickly. They will be investigated and prosecuted, Paolo announced, ending the broadcast. Thank you, Paolo. You helped us seek justice, said Mrs. Helena, emotional. It was my pleasure, Mrs. Helena. You deserve peace, Paolo responded, with a smile. We're relieved, said Carlos. In the following days, Mrs. Helena and Carlos' lives began to return to normal. Carlos, I feel a peace I haven't felt in a long time, Mrs. Helena said while having breakfast. You deserve it, Mrs. Helena. We've been through a lot, but now everything's all right, he replied, smiling. You're like a son to me, Carlos, she said, with tears in her eyes. And you're like a mother to me, Mrs. Helena, he responded, emotional. Their relationship grew even stronger. Shall we go for a walk today? We need to enjoy life, Carlos suggested. Great idea. Let's go to the park, Mrs. Helena agreed, excited. Nothing better than a little fresh air, he said, grabbing the picnic basket. I'm looking forward to it, she responded, with a smile. Let's go, he said, holding her hand. At the park, they walked and talked about the future. Carlos, I'm so happy you're in my life, Mrs. Helena said, looking at the horizon. Me too, Mrs. Helena. We have so much left to live, he responded, with hope. Let's make the most of every moment, she affirmed. Absolutely, he agreed, feeling a new energy. Over time, the story of Mrs. Helena and Carlos' resilience inspired many people. "You are an example of strength and courage," said a lady who recognized them in the park. "Thank you. We did what was right," Mrs. Helena responded, humbly. "You deserve all the happiness," the lady added. "We're living a new chapter," Carlos said, with a smile. And so, Mrs. Helena and Carlos began a new life together, stronger and more united than ever. "We've been through a lot, but now we're stronger," Mrs. Helena said, reflecting on the past. "Yes, and we have a bright future ahead," Carlos responded, with a hopeful smile. "I never imagined we would find so much strength in each other," she added, emotional.